This video is brought to you by NordVPN. In dramatic scenes this week, the UK government has blocked a proposal from the Scottish government to reform the specifics around gender recognition certificates, or GRCs. This has caused shockwaves across the political spectrum, with accusations that Westminster's Conservative government has blocked the democratic will of the people of Scotland. So in this video, we're going to have a look at the bill itself, demonstrating what it changes and explaining the reasons why Westminster decided to block it. In order to understand the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, we first need to understand the Gender Recognition Act, as the former amends the latter. Now, the Gender Recognition Act was passed by New Labour in 2004 and was the first legislative attempt to create something that allows someone to change their gender and it be recognised by the state. This could be done through being granted a Gender Recognition Certificate, or GRC. A GRC does three things. It amends the sex recorded on a birth certificate, allows trans people with GRCs to get married under their affirmed gender, and means their death certificate will list them as the affirmed gender. A GRC is not required to change the sex marker on your passport or driving licence, nor is one required for you to access sex-specific services or be protected as a trans person under the Equality Act. Now, the law only allows people to get a GRC if they meet the following criteria. They're 18, they've been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, and they've lived in their affirmed gender for at least 2 years. Once the application is submitted, a gender recognition panel, made up of medical and legal experts, assesses it to see whether the criteria for a GRC has been met. If the applicant is successful, then they're given a GRC and are recognised by the state as being their affirmed gender. Institutions that know of the applicant's assigned gender cannot share this information except in very specific circumstances. This is the state of affairs in the UK prior to the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform Bill. This bill aims to change the requirements in Scotland, stipulating that the applicant need only be 16 and they no longer need a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. It also reduces the time that the applicant needs to have lived in their affirmed gender. Now, it's important to note that the bill passed in Scotland with 86 MSPs voting for and 39 voting against. 54 members of the SNP voted for, 3 members of the Conservatives, all 7 members of the Green Party, 4 members of the Lib Dems and 18 members of Labour. The SNP, who are the governing party in Scotland, have used this to argue that the bill has cross-party support. So all indications would suggest that this would get royal assent from the King then. Well, unfortunately for the SNP and Scotland, this didn't happen. The UK government has blocked it. Now, to understand this, you need to understand a little about devolution in Scotland. In essence, Scotland has the ability to legislate on certain aspects of domestic legislation. Some powers, such as foreign policy, etc., are reserved, meaning it's something that Westminster has power over. And some are devolved, meaning that the Scottish government is able to legislate. Gender recognition is actually a specifically devolved power, as part of Head L, Justice. This means that Scotland has the ability to decide on its own laws on the matter. There is one catch though. On any devolved matter, the UK government can use a Section 35 notice from the Scotland Act to block it. They can only do this if the government thinks it isn't in the interests of defence or national security, or if the bill makes modifications of the law as it applies to reserved matters and which the Secretary of State has reasonable grounds to believe it would have an adverse effect on the operation of the law as it applies to reserved matters. Obviously, this has nothing to do with national security, so that route is closed to the government. Instead, they're using the second part of this. Anyway, let's move on to talking about how the government is justifying killing the bill. Their argument rests on the fact that while gender recognition is a devolved power, Equalities is not. And this is where the government thinks it has the scope to impose a Section 35 notice. They argue that the 2010 Equalities Act was carefully drafted in the light of and reflecting the specific limits of the 2004 Gender Recognition Act and the relative difficulty with which a person could legally change their sex. The bill alters that careful balance. After arguing this, Sunak's government begins to discuss single-sex groups, arguing that the bill's creation of a new cohort with the ability to change their legal sex will significantly change the profile and number of individuals that associations will be unable to exclude from membership on the grounds of sex. Now, this effectively means that people who wouldn't have been able to gain access to a group now would be able to, violating women's right to be in a single-sex group, which in turn goes against the Equalities Act. Now, it's worth saying that the Scottish Government disputes this argument entirely, with Social Justice Minister Shona Robertson arguing that transgender women can already be excluded from a female-only space whether or not they have a gender recognition certificate, and that the Scottish bill does not impact equalities law. Anyway, additionally, the government argues it'll affect equal pay. In essence, they argue that someone with a GRC may have lived as the opposite gender for a significant portion of their career, making comparisons for equal pay difficult. Making it easier to get a GRC will, the government argues, exacerbate this issue, again having an adverse effect on the Equalities Act. Now, the long and short of this is that while the government accepts that gender recognition is a devolved power and something the Scottish Government has the power and right to legislate on, that this bill doesn't just affect gender recognition, it affects equalities. Equalities is a reserved power and something the Scottish Government doesn't have the power or right to legislate on, and they therefore have the right to block the bill with a Section 35 notice. Now, the SNP are furious about this. First of all, this is the first time that a Section 35 notice has ever been used by the government, so any action here is by definition unprecedented. Secondly, the consultation for the bill began in 2017, about 5 years ago, where the SNP received more than 15,000 responses. More than 60% of these were positive. Since then, it had gone through every hurdle required for a bill to become law, and at the last moment, Westminster blocks it. The Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has claimed that the government's decision to use a Section 35 notice will inevitably end up in court. We don't yet know what the timescale is for this to go through the courts, but the Westminster government is going to really need to put its thinking cap on in the meantime and prepare to justify it a bit further if they really do want to block it. With things like this continuing into 2023, it's easy to feel that the world is an increasingly unsafe place. Fortunately, when it comes to your personal life and digital safety, NordVPN has your back. It's an unfortunate reality that online scams and phishing attacks are on the rise right now. With us getting bombarded by emails from our banks, social media accounts, and even annoying newsletters we forgot we even signed up to, it's easy to click the wrong thing. One weak link can compromise security and bring things crashing down. With the protection of NordVPN though, you can use their threat protection features to identify potentially suspicious links. Even if you did reach a suspicious website, NordVPN's data encryption tools would protect against a number of other attacks like malicious man-in-the-middle breaches. Even if things do go wrong, NordVPN's dark web monitoring is always scanning for your details and passwords, and can actively notify you before you even notice. It's easy to think that it won't happen to you, or that you won't be fooled, but these scams are pretty subtle, and when we see even massive firms falling for it, it's worth protecting yourself as much as you can. So click the link in the description or go to nordvpn.com/TLDR to get a huge discount on their 2-year plan, and with their 30-day money-back guarantee, you've got nothing to lose. Thanks for your support, and make sure to click the link in the description.